banished to the freezing streets by the very people who raised her, 17-year-old Eva sought refuge in a decaying mansion. Deep beneath the attic floorboards, a rusted lockbox waited in the dark. Its contents held a venomous twist. The parents who just discarded her were actually her mother's killers. The rain in Boston that November evening didn't fall. It pelted the pavement with the sharp, unforgiving sting of crushed glass. For Eva Harrington, the freezing downpour was merely a physical manifestation of the reality she had endured for 17 years. She stood shivering on the curb of 42nd and Oakhaven Drive, a single, flimsy black trash bag clutched in her trembling hands. Inside were the pathetic sum of her belongings: 3 pairs of jeans, a faded sweater, a battered copy of Wuthering Heights, and a toothbrush. Less than 10 minutes ago, the heavy oak front door of the Harrington residence had slammed shut with a finality that still echoed in her bones. "You're 17 now, old enough to be someone else's problem," Richard Harrington had sneered, his face a mask of contempt under the amber glow of the porch light. He hadn't even raised his voice. He didn't need to. The quiet malice in his tone was a weapon he had honed over a lifetime of emotional cruelty. Beside him, Sylvia Harrington had stood with her arms crossed over her expensive cashmere cardigan. Her expression was utterly devoid of the maternal warmth society promised. "Don't bother calling the police, Eva," Sylvia had said, her voice smooth and cold as polished marble. "Legally, we are no longer obligated to house a runaway, and that's exactly what we'll tell them you are. Now get off our property before Richard turns the sprinklers on." They hadn't even given her a coat. Eva's boots splashed through the rising puddles as she began to walk, her mind a chaotic blur of shock and survival instinct. The neon signs of downtown storefronts bled into blurry, luminous streaks through the curtain of rain. She passed O'Malley's pub, where the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking glasses mocked her isolation. She was entirely alone. No aunts, no uncles, no friends whose parents would be willing to cross the wealthy and influential Harringtons. Her lungs burned with the icy air as she navigated the labyrinth of alleyways, trying to avoid the main streets where the police cruisers idled. The damp chill was beginning to seep into her bones, making her joints ache and her teeth chatter violently. Hypothermia was a very real threat, and as the midnight hour approached, the city's predatory underbelly began to stir. Desperation dragged a buried memory to the forefront of her mind. Arthur Belmont. Arthur had been Sylvia's father, Eva's grandfather. He had died 2 years prior under sudden, murky circumstances, leaving behind a sprawling, dilapidated Victorian estate on the edge of the city at 88 Ashbury Lane. The estate had been tied up in a vicious probate dispute ever since, leaving the property abandoned, boarded up, and swallowed by overgrowth. Sylvia despised the house, and never visited. Richard considered it an eyesore. Forever, it was a sanctuary. It took her 2 grueling hours to traverse the city on foot. By the time the wrought iron gates of the Belmont estate loomed out of the fog, Eva was operating on pure adrenaline and muscle memory. The iron was cold and slick, but she managed to scale the side fence, dropping heavily into the overgrown rhododendron bushes on the other side. The house was a hulking silhouette against the stormy sky, its turreted roof stabbing into the low-hanging clouds. Tall weeds whipped at her calves as she sprinted up the crumbling stone steps to the wraparound porch. The front door was heavily padlocked, but Eva remembered a secret from her sparse, secret visits with her grandfather. The coal chute on the side of the house. Scrambling through the mud, she found the heavy iron grate. Her frozen fingers slipped twice, tearing a nail down to the quick before she managed to pry it open. With a desperate heave, she slid feet first into the absolute darkness of the cellar. She hit the dusty concrete floor hard, the the trash bag acting as a meager cushion. For a long moment, Eva just lay there in the pitch black, the smell of damp earth, old coal and mildew filling her nostrils. The silence of the house was oppressive, yet incredibly comforting. She was safe from the rain. She was safe from the streets. And most importantly, she was safe from Richard and Sylvia. Using the faint ambient light filtering through the chute, she navigated the cellar stairs, her boots creaking against the rotting wood. She pushed open the door to the main hallway. The house was a graveyard of furniture draped in white sheets, looking like ghosts frozen in time. The air was frigid, holding the deep, settled cold of a building unheated for winters on end. She needed warmth. The lower floors were too damp, the air thick with moisture. She instinctively looked upward toward the grand, sweeping staircase. Heat rises, she reasoned, and in the vast, empty mansion, the attic would be the driest place, perhaps holding old quilts or rugs left behind in the estate freeze. Dragging her trash bag behind her, Eva began the long ascent to the top of the Belmont house. With every step, a strange, prickling sensation crept up the back of her neck. It wasn't the irrational fear of ghosts or the dark. It was a heavy, suffocating feeling of anticipation, as if the house had been waiting for her to return. The entrance to the attic was a narrow, unassumingly plain door at the very end of the third-floor corridor. It stuck in its frame, swollen by years of humidity, forcing Eva to throw her entire body weight against the wood. With a loud, agonizing groan, it gave way, sending a cloud of centuries-old dust billowing into her face. She climbed the steep, narrow steps, emerging into a cavernous space beneath the exposed wooden rafters. The only illumination came from a large, circular window at the far end, its stained glass partially shattered, allowing a brilliant shaft of moonlight to slice through the gloom. The storm outside had begun to break, the heavy rain tapering off into a misty drizzle. The attic was a chaotic museum of Arthur Belmont's life. Stacks of leather-bound ledgers, broken armchairs, rusted bird cages, and decaying steamer trunks formed a labyrinth of forgotten history. Eva wrapped her arms around herself, shivering violently as she moved through the clutter. She found a heavy, moth-eaten wool blanket draped over a dressmaker's dummy and immediately pulled it around her shoulders. She retreated to the brick chimney breast in the center of the room, seeking a place to sit and ride out the night. As she slid down against the rough masonry, her boot caught the edge of a floorboard. It didn't just creak, it shifted. Eva paused, her brow furrowing. She tapped the board with her heel. A hollow, distinct thud echoed back, curiosity briefly overriding her exhaustion. She knelt. The oak board was shorter than the others, neatly sawed and fitted with a precision that betrayed intentional design. Her grandfather had been a carpenter in his youth, a man obsessed with puzzles, hidden compartments, and secrecy. Using the rusted edge of an old iron fire poker, she found leaning against a trunk. She wedged the tip into the seam. She pressed down with all her remaining strength. The rusty nails shrieked in protest before the board popped up, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity between the floor joists. Eva reached blindly into the hole. Her fingers brushed against cold, unyielding metal. Grasping a heavy iron handle, she hauled the object up into the moonlight. It was a heavy, olive-green military-style lockbox. It was caked in a thick layer of grime, the brass latches oxidized to a dull green. A heavy master lock secured the front. Eva's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Why would Arthur hide this so meticulously? She wasn't about to let a padlock stop her now. Adrenaline surging, she gripped the heavy iron fire poker with both hands, raised it high above her head, and brought it down violently against the lock. Clang! The noise was deafening in the silent house. She struck it again, and again. On the fourth brutal strike, the rusted shackle snapped. Eva tossed the poker aside and pulled the lock free. With trembling hands, she flipped the latches. The hinges screamed as she opened the lid. The box smelled of dried lavender and stale paper. Inside, resting on top of a stack of manila folders, was a delicate silver locket. Eva picked it up, her thumb brushing over the intricate floral engraving on the front. She popped it open. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of a woman. Eva gasped, dropping the locket as if it had burned her. The woman in the photo, with her piercing green eyes, high cheekbones and wild cascade of auburn hair, looked exactly like her. It was like staring into a mirror, reflecting a decade into the future. But this wasn't Sylvia. Sylvia was blonde, petite, and had the pale, icy blue eyes of the Belmont family. Desperate now, Eva tore into the first manila folder. It contained brittle, yellowed newspaper clippings dated October 14, 2009. Tragedy on Interstate 95. Heiress Genevieve Sterling dead in fiery crash. Infant daughter missing. Eva's eyes flew over the text. Genevieve Sterling, the sole inheritor of the Sterling pharmaceutical fortune, had been run off the road in a torrential storm. The car had plunged into a ravine. Genevieve was killed on impact, but the authorities were baffled by the empty car seat in the back. The infant, Madeline Sterling, was gone. No body was ever recovered. The police presumed the child had been thrown from the vehicle and swept away by the nearby swollen river. Eva's breath came in short, jagged gasps. She tossed the article aside and grabbed a stiff piece of parchment from the bottom of the box. A birth certificate, State of Massachusetts. Name, Madeline Rose Sterling. Date of birth, August 29th, 2009. Mother, Genevieve Claire Sterling. Father, unknown. August 29th, 2009. That was Eva's birthday. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "No, this is insane. This is just a coincidence." But her hands betrayed her denial as she reached for the final item in the box, a thick, black leather journal. The initials AB were embossed in gold on the cover. Arthur Belmont. She opened it to a page marked by a dried, pressed rose. The handwriting was her grandfather's, cramped, jagged, and frantic. November 12th, 2009. May God forgive me for what I have allowed to happen under my own roof. Sylvia and Richard arrived tonight in the dead of winter. They brought a child, a baby girl. Sylvia claimed they adopted her privately, but Richard was sweating, pacing like a cornered animal. There was blood on the cuffs of his shirt. I recognized the baby's blanket. It was the same one on the news. The Sterling baby. Eva's vision blurred. A tear slipped down her cheek, landing with a soft tap on the aged paper. She kept reading. I confronted them. Richard laughed in my face. He told me he didn't run Genevieve off the road, but he was the first car behind her when it happened. He pulled the baby from the wreckage. He didn't call the police. He knew the Sterling Trust Fund transferred to the child upon Genevieve's death. Richard works at the bank, handling the Sterling accounts. He took the child. He forged the adoption papers through a corrupt judge in his pocket. He told me if I went to the police, he would frame me as an accomplice, ensuring my business and my life were destroyed. Sylvia stood there and agreed. My own daughter. They are raising her as Eva Harrington. They don't love her. They just need her alive until her 18th birthday, when the trust dissolves and the guardian assumes legal control of the assets. Eva dropped the journal. The impact of the revelation hit her with the force of a freight train, knocking the wind from her lungs. She wasn't a Harrington. She wasn't an unwanted burden, discarded by a cruel mother and an apathetic father. She was Madeline Sterling, and the people who had verbally and emotionally abused her for 17 years, the people who had thrown her onto the freezing streets tonight, like common garbage, were the very monsters who had stolen her from the wreckage of her mother's death to steal a multi-million-dollar fortune. Suddenly, Richard's words from an hour ago took on a terrifying, sinister new meaning. You're 17 now, old enough to be someone else's problem. Wait. The Journal said they needed her alive until her 18th birthday. Why would they kick her out months before the payout? Eva scrambled through the remaining papers in the folder, her hands violently shaking. At the very bottom was a freshly printed document, dated only 2 weeks ago. It was a life insurance policy taken out by Richard and Sylvia Harrington. The insured? Eva Harrington. The payout upon accidental death or disappearance? $5 million. They hadn't kicked her out to be rid of her. They had kicked her out into the freezing storm, into the deadliest parts of the city, hoping she wouldn't survive the night. And if the elements didn't kill her, someone else would. A sharp, sudden sound shattered the silence of the attic. Downstairs, the heavy iron grate of the coal chute slammed shut, followed by the heavy, methodical thud of wet boots stepping onto the main floor. Thud, thud, thud. Someone had followed her. The heavy, methodical thud of wet boots on the main floor sent a paralyzing jolt of pure adrenaline through Eva's veins. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was not rushed. It was the terrifying, deliberate pacing of a predator who knew its prey was cornered. Eva scrambled backward, her hands frantically gathering the brittle newspaper clippings, the birth certificate, and Arthur's leather journal. She shoved them deep into her black trash bag, her fingers slick with cold sweat. She left the empty lockbox and the silver locket on the floorboards. She didn't have time to retrieve them. Eva. The voice slithered up the stairwell, echoing off the high plaster ceilings of the Belmont estate. It wasn't a stranger's voice. It wasn't a police officer looking for a vagrant. It was Richard Harrington. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sharp gasp she barely stifled by clamping both hands over her mouth. Richard was here. He hadn't just kicked her out to let the elements take her. He had hunted her. He knew this house was her only sanctuary. He had driven from their pristine, gated mansion in Weston down to the decaying edges of the city just to make sure the cold, hard streets had finished the job. Or to finish it himself. "I know you're up there, sweetheart," Richard called out, the false endearment dripping with a venomous, mocking sweetness. "I saw the grate to the coal chute. You always were a predictable little rat, scurrying back to Arthur's mouldy tomb." Eva backed into the deepest shadows of the attic, pressing her spine against the rough brick of the chimney breast. Her eyes darted around the cavernous room, desperately seeking a weapon. Her gaze landed on the heavy, wrought-iron fire poker she had used to smash the master lock. It lay near the center of the room, illuminated by the shaft of moonlight cutting through the broken stained glass. It was 5 feet away. A lifetime away. The footsteps began ascending the second-floor staircase. The old wood shrieked under his weight. "Did you really think Sylvia and I would just let you wander the streets of Boston?" Richard's voice was closer now, vibrating through the floorboards. "You're a liability, Eva. A 17-year-old runaway is a tragedy, a tragic statistic. The police will search for a few days, find a body in the harbor, and close the file. It's a harsh world out there for a homeless girl." He was at the third-floor landing. Only the narrow, swollen door separated him from the attic stairs. Eva's heart hammered a frantic, deafening rhythm against her ribs. She was no longer just a terrified teenager. A new, searing heat had ignited in her chest. It was the white-hot fury of Madeline Sterling. For 17 years, this man had belittled her, starved her of affection, and manipulated her reality, all while sitting on a stolen pharmaceutical fortune built by the mother he had let die. He wasn't her father. He was her captor, and he was about to become her murderer. The swollen attic door violently shuddered as Richard kicked it. Once, twice. The aged wood splintered, and the door gave way with a sickening crack. A blinding beam from a tactical flashlight pierced the gloom, sweeping over the dust-covered steamer trunks and draped furniture. Behind the glare, Richard's silhouette stepped into the attic. In his right hand, the flashlight. In his left, catching the moonlight with a dull, lethal gleam, was a suppressed handgun. "Where are you hiding?" he muttered, his voice losing its mocking lilt, replaced by a cold, clinical edge. The beam of light swept across the floor, stopping dead on the broken lockbox and the shattered padlock. Richard froze. From her vantage point in the shadows, Eva watched as the arrogant posture of her tormentor completely shattered. He took a hesitant step forward, shining the light directly into the empty cavity between the floorboards. He saw the empty olive-green box. He saw the silver locket gleaming on the dust. "No," Richard whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden, naked panic. "No, no, no. The old bastard promised me he destroyed it." He violently kicked the empty lockbox across the room. It clattered noisily against a rusted birdcage. "Eva!" he roared, the silence of the mansion shattering. "Come out here right now. You don't understand what you're looking at. It's the ramblings of a senile old man." He began tearing through the attic, flipping over armchairs and kicking aside boxes, his flashlight beam slicing erratically through the dark. He was moving toward the chimney. Eva knew she had seconds before the beam caught her. She looked at the fire poker resting on the floor. She looked at a heavy antique dressmaker's dummy draped in a white sheet standing 3 feet to her left. As Richard stepped around a towering stack of leather-bound ledgers, Eva lunged. She didn't grab the poker. Instead, she threw her entire body weight against the heavy, solid wood dressmaker's dummy, shoving it directly into Richard's path. Startled by the sudden movement in his peripheral vision, Richard fired. The suppressed pistol emitted a sharp, coughing thwip, and a bullet tore through the white sheet, burying itself in the wooden torso. But the momentum of the heavy dummy carried it forward, crashing directly into his chest. Richard stumbled backward with a grunt of pain, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the uneven floorboards, casting wild, spinning shadows on the rafters. Using the distraction, Eva dove for the fire poker. Her fingers clamped around the freezing iron handle. She didn't hesitate. Operating on pure survival instinct, she swung the heavy iron rod in a wide, vicious arc, aiming for his knees. The iron connected with bone with a sickening crack. Richard screamed, a sound of absolute agony that tore through the quiet night. His leg buckled, and he collapsed heavily onto the dusty floor, the gun flying from his grip and sliding away into the darkness. Eva didn't wait to see if he would recover. Clutching her black trash bag tightly against her chest, she bolted for the stairs. "You little bitch!" Richard howled from the darkness, his voice strained with pain and fury. "You have nothing! Nobody will believe you. You're a crazy runaway. I'm Richard Harrington. I own this city." Eva ignored him, taking the narrow attic stairs 3 at a time in the pitch black. She hit the third-floor corridor, sprinting toward the grand staircase. Her lungs burned, her legs ached, but the adrenaline propelled her forward. She flew down the main staircase, her boots slipping on the dusty marble, nearly twisting her ankle, but she caught the banister and kept moving. She didn't go back to the coal chute. She ran straight for the massive padlocked front door. To the left of the door was a tall parlor window. Grabbing a heavy brass candlestick from a nearby console table, she smashed the glass. The sharp shatter echoed loudly, but she didn't care. She cleared the jagged shards with the brass base, threw her bag through the opening, and vaulted out into the damp, freezing night. She hit the overgrown rhododendron bushes, scrambled to her feet, and ran toward the wrought iron gates. The storm had passed, leaving behind a bitter, biting cold, and a sky slowly beginning to lighten with the bruised purple of pre-dawn. She was out. She was alive, and she had the evidence. But Richard was right about one thing. He was wealthy, connected, and influential. If she walked into a local Boston PD precinct, a precinct that likely relied on the Harrington family's generous charity gala donations, she would be detained as a runaway and handed right back to him. The life insurance policy would be cashed out by the end of the week. She needed a higher authority. She needed someone utterly untouchable. By early morning, Boston had already come alive. Commuters rushing through the streets, coffee in hand, unaware of the girl sitting alone on a damp bench in Boston Common. Eva's clothes were soaked, her hands scraped and raw, her body trembling from exhaustion. But her mind had never been sharper. For 3 hours, she had hidden inside a fluorescent-lit laundromat, studying every page of Arthur Belmont's journal and every newspaper clipping. She memorized everything: names, dates, financial institutions. One detail stood out. The original investigation into Genevieve Sterling's death had been escalated to the FBI due to suspected tampering with the car's brakes. That was her opening. Clutching her trash bag tightly, Eva stood and began walking toward Government Center. The John F. Kennedy Federal Building rose before her, cold and imposing, a fortress of concrete and glass, exactly what she needed. She ignored the nearby police cruisers and walked straight inside. The guards at security eyed her warily. She looked like what she was: injured, exhausted, and homeless. "I need to speak to an FBI agent," she said, her voice rough but steady. "It's about a kidnapping, fraud, and attempted murder." The guards hesitated, unconvinced. Eva took a breath and raised her voice. "My name is Madeline Sterling. I'm the daughter of Genevieve Sterling. She was murdered in 2009, and the man responsible is trying to kill me." The words froze the room. Within minutes, she was escorted upstairs into an interview room. Special Agent David Kessler entered shortly after, placing a cup of hot coffee in front of her. His expression was calm but skeptical. "Madeline Sterling has been presumed dead for 17 years, he said. "Convince me." Eva didn't argue. She emptied her bag onto the table, documents, clippings, and the journal. "Read the entry marked with the pressed rose," she said quietly. Kessler adjusted his glasses and began reading. As the minutes passed, his posture changed. Skepticism gave way to focus, then to something sharper: concern. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "Hidden in my grandfather's house," Eva replied. "Richard Harrington tried to kill me last night. If you send agents now, you'll find evidence." That was enough. Kessler stood and immediately called for action. Tactical teams, financial freezes, coordinated raids. Within hours, everything collapsed. At the Harrington estate, agents stormed in to find Richard preparing to flee, cash stuffed into a duffel bag. He didn't get far. Sylvia was arrested moments later, her composure unraveling as the charges were read aloud: kidnapping, fraud, attempted murder. The truth spread quickly. Evidence surfaced: ballistics, financial trails, falsified records. Under pressure, Sylvia confessed. The crash that killed Genevieve Sterling had not been an accident. It had been planned. Forever, the aftermath felt unreal. She was placed under federal protection, moved into a secure hotel, while teams of lawyers worked to restore her identity. Piece by piece, the life stolen from her was returned. One evening, she stood before a mirror, studying her reflection. For years, She had felt like she didn't belong in her own skin. Now she understood why. She wasn't Eva Harrington. She was Madeline Sterling. And for the first time in her life, she finally knew who she was. The rusted lockbox didn't just hold yellowed paper. It held the master key to a stolen life. Madeline Sterling, once discarded as the unwanted Eva Harrington, stood on the balcony of her rightful estate, breathing in the crisp air of freedom. The Harringtons traded luxury for prison cells, their boundless greed their ultimate undoing. She was no longer a victim. She was the sole architect of her own future.